Hello and welcome to the BucketLister Podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the BucketLister Podcast. I am your host Keith Crockford and today I am going to be chatting about Annapurna. And the reason why I am going to be talking about Annapurna is because I've just spent the weekend at the destination show in London. And one of the most asked questions to us over the weekend was, what are the differences between the Annapurna Circuit Trek and the Annapurna Base Camp Trek? So what I thought is I would record this podcast so we could signpost people in and I can talk about the differences between the two treks themselves. Now, personally, I don't think the Annapurna region gets as much hype as it deserves because it just gets overruled a little bit by the Everest Base Camp Trek. Now, I know this because we sell all of the treks, and I know how many Everest Base Camp treks we run a year compared to how many treks to the Annapurna region we do a year. And I kind of think that's because people obviously see that Everest Base Camp is on people's bucket list. They want to go and see the highest mountain in the world. And of course they do. And I know we've spoken about Annapurna before on the podcast. I've done a whole podcast with Dave about the Annapurna Circuit Trek. And I've done one about Everest Base Camp versus Annapurna Circuit Trek. So we've spoken quite a lot about it, but we've never compared the two different treks there. And also we spoke about it recently as well when we had the problems in the autumn with flights to Lukla and saying how the Annapurna range is an option. And obviously it's much more accessible than Everest Base Camp is in terms of flights to Lukla. So I think it does deserve more hype. It does deserve more popularity. It is a completely stunning trek. Both of them are completely stunning treks. And I'm just going to spend some time today just chatting about the two and comparing them and trying to give you a bit more information on each. And hopefully that will make you add one of them to your bucket list, and maybe you can see which one would better suit you if you were to head out trekking in Nepal. Now, I suppose if we start off and look at duration, because that's probably one of the biggest factors in terms of which trek you would choose. Generally, when you go trekking in Nepal, it is a 18-day trip, whether it's a Everest Base Camp Trek or an Annapurna Circuit Trek. You know, generally like 18 is the shortest amount of time you can go and do out there. Whereas with an Annapurna Base Camp Trek, you can kind of get it done in a 2-week trip. So I think our trip out there is 14, 15 days, dependent on flights. So you can almost get it done within a 2 weeks worth of annual leave, whereas you'd almost need 3 weeks if you were going to look at doing an Annapurna Circuit Trek. Now, our Annapurna Base Camp Trek is a 10-day trek. Our Annapurna Circuit Trek is a 14-day trek. So it is shorter. So for a lot of people, that might be quite high on the list of the reasons for choosing an Annapurna Base Camp Trek. In terms of the altitude itself, obviously on the Annapurna Circuit Trek, you go across the Thorungla Pass, which is the world's highest pass at 5,416 meters. So actually higher than you are at Everest Base Camp. On the Annapurna Base Camp Trek, your highest point is considerably lower at only 4,130 meters, which is actually the base camp itself. So if you've ever had any problems with altitude, then you might then want to choose a base camp trek to Annapurna rather than the circuit trek. You will also spend less time you won't sleep above 4,000 meters on a base camp trek, whereas on an Annapurna Circuit Trek, you will spend several days sleeping above 4,000 meters. The Circuit Trek is, I would say, it is considered as far more strenuous, generally because of its length of the trek, but more importantly because of the altitude and going over the high pass. Now, that's a really hard, tough day to get over the pass. And depending on the weather, it can make it even more difficult. So you do have to consider that when you're choosing which trek you want to do. So I would say the Annapurna Base Camp Trek is easier. It is less strenuous because of duration, but more importantly, the altitude and the time you spend at altitude. So that I would consider like really important. In terms of the starting points for the treks, the Circuit Trek generally starts at Besasar, where you would take a truck from Kathmandu, which would be 7 hours from Kathmandu realistically to get there. You can take a local bus, a tourist bus that goes, or you could take a private transfer. For our Annapurna Circuit Trek, we start at Nagadi, and then for base camp, quite a lot of people will start at Nepal, but we start ours at Gandrung for our Annapurna Base Camp Trek. You get there from Pokhara. Now, the advantages you have on a base camp trek is, again, you can go by bus to Pokhara, whether that's you can take the tourist bus, there's a local bus, or you could take a private transfer. Or the other option you have to go to Pokhara then is you can fly, and it's a 30-minute flight from Kathmandu. And Pokhara flights still go from Kathmandu in the trekking season. So that could be a good option for you if you don't want to spend your time sat on a bus. And then from Pokhara then for the ABC trek, it's kind of an hour and a bit's drive to get to the starting point for the trek. But you would spend the night in Pokhara, and then the following morning you would get up and then you would go and start your trek. Now, there are lots of starting points for these treks. It depends. And again, I said that our Annapurna Base Camp Trek is 10 days, but you can do an Annapurna Base Camp Trek anything from 7 to 12 days, depending on your starting point, which trekking agency you're with, whether you're doing it yourself. There are different start points for both of the treks to make them shorter or longer. For an Annapurna Circuit Trek, that's anything from kind of 13, 14 days trekking up to 20 days trekking, depending on your starting point and your finishing point. Now, the Annapurna Circuit Trek, as the name suggests, is a circuit. And for us, we'll finish in Jompson, and then you will fly back from Jompson to Pokhara. I think it being a circuit makes it quite nice, because you get different scenery every day. It's not the Annapurna Base Camp is up and back the same trail. You can do a few deviations on the way back down, but ultimately you are walking up to base camp and back down in the similar way of an Everest Base Camp Trek, where you would walk up and walk back down the same way. So obviously on the Annapurna Circuit Trek, once you get to a certain point, it's the same distance whether you come back the way you came or you go round. So if you have a problem, you've kind of at some point still got to carry on, especially if you've been over the pass. There's no point coming back over the pass again. Whereas if you had a problem on an Annapurna Base Camp Trek, you could just turn around and head back down the way you came. So again, maybe something to consider, to think about. In terms of the scenery, this is one reason why I think Annapurna does deserve more hype than it gets, because the scenery is just absolutely stunning on either of the trips. I would say the Annapurna Circuit Trek offers a more diverse landscape than the Base Camp Trek. So you would start off in subtropical forests, you would head up over the terraces, and then you would then go into the landscapes and over the pass. And then there is a lot of traditional villages on the way. Whereas on the Annapurna Base Camp Trek, because it is lower, it's in the much more dense rhododendron forests, but you do get a direct view of the Annapurna range. Obviously, with the Circuit Trek, you're getting stunning panoramic views because you are trekking all the way around the Annapurna range. Whereas with a Base Camp Trek, you are getting a much closer and, I would say, more of a unobstructed view of Annapurna 1 and the Massif. But you are getting to see the same thing on the way up and on the way back. Don't take that completely as a negative, because, the views change every day. I was over there trekking for a couple of days in this region on our best of Nepal trip at the end of last year. And when we arrived at Australian camp, it was misty, it was cloudy, you couldn't see anything. And then you woke up in the morning to perfect blue skies, and the most amazing view over Annapurna and Fishtail. And so, the views do change every day. So even though you are going up and back the same way, I wouldn't say that was necessarily a negative, because it might be that on the way back you get better weather, or it's just different, and the views you get look different anyway. So I don't think you would really think that you are missing out if you kind of see what I mean. So in terms of the climate between the two, obviously the Annapurna Circuit Trek, because of its length and its difference in altitudes from start to finish, you will have a wider range of climates depending on when you're trekking there. But obviously you could have warmer subtropical climates when you're down the bottom in the forests, and then once you get up, you're going to end up with colder temperatures once you get up over the pass and you're more into the mountain ranges itself. It can be very cold. I know a couple of years ago, Dave did an Annapurna Circuit Trek with one of our groups, and the pass had only just opened because there was that much snow on the pass that it was only just deemed to be passable. So, that might be something to consider as well. The time of year you're going, like early in the season, just be prepared that might be an issue, sort of like March time. Whereas with an Annapurna Base Camp Trek, obviously with much less variation, because of the altitude, it will be still cold in the mornings and in the evenings. But the change in temperature is going to be far less drastic due to the lower altitudes that you're going to be doing on an ABC trek compared to a circuit trek. In terms of the accommodation, that's in tea houses, whether you're on which trek you're on, pretty much very similar to an Everest Base Camp Trek. You'll stay in a tea house every night. The trails are quite commercial. They do rely on trekkers. They are well, you'll have internet. There will be, bakeries and coffee shops on the way in some of the villages, because they know that they've got tourists coming. In terms of food, whichever trek you're on in Nepal, you'll get fed very, very well. All of the menus are very similar from tea house to tea house. There's lots of variety, but the menu will be the same from one tea house to the other. And you will have your 3 meals a day at a tea house, where you will order it off a menu. So you will get very well fed on an Annapurna trek, whichever one you choose. So you don't need to worry about that. In terms of altitude, obviously we've discussed the fact that you're going to spend, you're going to sleep above 4,000 meters on a Annapurna Circuit Trek, where you're not going to do that on an Annapurna Base Camp Trek. So the risks of altitude are a lot less on a base camp trek. If you, like I said before, if you've suffered with altitude before, maybe you've done Mount Toubkal, maybe you've done Kilimanjaro, and you kind of had a few issues with the altitude, then you might want to be thinking about a base camp trek over a circuit trek. In terms, the Annapurna Circuit Trek gives a good altitude profile. There is plenty of time to acclimatize on the trek, so don't think bad of that. You will have plenty of time to acclimatize. You will be able to go nice and slowly. It is perfectly safe in terms of the altitude gains on a daily basis. But if you are prone to suffer with altitude, then it might be that you think about an Annapurna Base Camp Trek. In terms of the culture itself, I would say the Annapurna Circuit Trek passes through more unique villages on the way, which would give you a deeper culture immersion into the area. You're still passing through villages on the base camp trek, but the villages are pretty much the same. So what you see in one village will be the same as you see in the next village, whereas there are more different ethnic groups living on the circuit trek route. So therefore, when you get to different villages, you will see different things. So I would say the circuit is known more for its cultural diversity, shall we say, in terms of what you're going to see on the trek. So if you're wanting to immerse yourself in that, then a Annapurna Circuit Trek may be the option for you to think about choosing. Obviously, we've said about like best times to go, and what I would say is if you're on an Annapurna Base Camp Trek, then potentially think about going in the October season, because you're spending so much time in the rhododendron forests. It's a lovely time of the year to go after the monsoon season and after they've had all the rains. Everything is so lush and so green. And you just get such amazing views of the mountains, as well as all of the flora and fauna as well. So that would be a great time to go. I've trekked in the Annapurna region in the monsoon season. I would certainly never recommend it for Everest Base Camp, but it is possible that if the only time you can go trekking in Nepal is in July and August, say you're a school teacher, or that's the only time you can take the children away or whatever, then it is still possible to go trekking through the Annapurna Base Camp Trek during those times. Like I say, I've done it several times with school groups over the years, and it is a possibility. It is very humid. It is, just beware of the leeches. That's one thing I will say. And you do need to make sure you are checking each other. I always remember I was there with Tony, one of our guides at the Bucket List Company, and then another guide as well. And I remember we had a school group with us, and we got into the tea house in the evening. We were all stood outside, sorting the bags out, getting ready to go in. And one of the guides that was with us, he had a pair of shorts on, and then I saw running down the inside of his leg a line of blood. And I pointed it out to him, and you could just see the sheer panic on his face of when he realized that there was a leech somewhere where there shouldn't have been a leech. And he quickly ran into the shower. And let's just say we had great amusement when he told us the story of how he had to get this leech off somewhere where, as a man, you certainly wouldn't want a leech to be attached. But yeah, so just be wary if you are trekking in that region in the monsoon season to do that. And in terms of the weather, we kind of had really heavy downpours in the morning and then late in the evening, but pretty much during the day when we were trekking, when we were over there, although it was humid, it was dry. So that is possible in that region if that's the only time that you can make it and the only time you can go. In terms of equipment, pretty much you're going to need trekking gear for whichever one you do. It wouldn't be a massive kit list. I would say you would need more layers for an Annapurna Circuit Trek just because of the differences in temperatures when you are going over the pass. It might be that you need spikes for going over the pass, but again, you would need to check the weather before. If you were quite early on in the season, it might be that you would need spikes. You probably wouldn't need crampons, but spikes would be advisable. But again, they can be got in Kathmandu, so you wouldn't need to take those with you. They're not expensive. You could pick up a set when you were there. So, and you could look at that closer to the time. In terms of permits, you need the same permits whether you're doing a Annapurna Circuit Trek or an Annapurna Base Camp Trek. You need 2 permits for that region. You need your TIMS card, which is wherever you're trekking in Nepal, and that's your Trekkers Information Management System card. And then for the Annapurna region, you would also need your ACAP or your Annapurna Conservation Area Project permit. Both of those can be got in Kathmandu or Pokhara, depending on where you are. But if you are trekking with an agency or you're booking a trip with a bucket list company or any other company, they should sort your permits out for you. Like, we would get all of your information. We would get your passport photos done and get a copy of them and get all of your information ready. So when you arrived, your permits were all sorted. So you wouldn't need to worry about that. It would only be if you were going out there on your own that you would need to sort your permits out. So it's quite simple. They're not expensive. Like, I would say that's probably about $50, something around those for those 2 permits at the minute. So you wouldn't need to have anything more than that. Obviously, in terms of, you would need travel insurance for both, making sure it covered you for the altitude. Most travel policies, like your bank policies, won't cover you for trekking above maybe 3,000 meters or 4,000 meters. So you would need a specialist policy that covered you for trekking above 4,000 meters, because you would be doing that on both of the treks. So the same insurance would cover either of them. And obviously we recommend Campbell Irvine is ours, but there are others out there. But Campbell Irvine have always been very good to deal with. We found all of our guides are insured by them. So take a look at them if you want. And that's kind of pretty much everything there is to sort of consider really about either of those 2 treks. Now, I think, there's 2 factors there that I think most people would consider when they're thinking about the trek. The first being about the length. If you can go for a longer trek, then I would recommend the Annapurna Circuit. If you're time constrained, then you might want to think about the Annapurna Base Camp Trek. Obviously, the altitude and how hard the trek is the other one. And obviously, if you have suffered with altitude before, if you're worried about the altitude, then you might want to go with a base camp trek. If you've done, Kilimanjaro before, or done Everest Base Camp before, then you should be fine on an Annapurna Circuit Trek. What we have found is a lot of people who have been and done Everest Base Camp before have loved trekking in Nepal, and then they want to go and do something else. So they've then gone and done the Annapurna, and speaking to them afterwards, it's been really interesting to see how they did enjoy. They wanted to go to Everest Base Camp because they wanted to see Everest, but then once they had once they'd experienced the Annapurna, actually many of them enjoyed the Annapurna Circuit Trek more, or the Annapurna Base Camp Trek more, because of it's just a quieter trail. You know, you're not part of that tourist route going up. Although it is, you know, it can still have trekkers on it. It certainly isn't as many on a daily basis as what's going through, you know, Everest Base Camp and on that route. So if you like quiet places, then this would be more suited to you, I would say, than an Everest Base Camp Trek. But I would love to get more people out doing treks in the Annapurna region. It is truly stunning, and I hope that you found this episode informative and interesting, and it might have moved a trek in the Annapurna region slightly higher up your bucket lists, because I think, like I said before, I think it just does deserve more hype and more people to go and experience it and see actually how stunning the region itself is. So please do consider it when you are thinking of trekking to Nepal. I will add in the show notes links to both of our two treks, the Annapurna Circuit and the Annapurna Base Camp. And I also did a blog post comparing the two a while ago, and I'll attach that in so you can have a read of that as well. But I've pretty much covered off most of that in this podcast anyway. If you've got any questions, if you don't know which one is right for you, you still can't decide. If you can't decide between Everest Base Camp or one of the Annapurna treks, and you want to have a chat with us, then please do get in contact, whether it's on social media, email, pick up the phone and give us a call, because we'd always be happy to chat through the options with you, and kind of help you make your mind up which might be the right trek for you in Nepal. Because I think if you love trekking, then you certainly should go to Nepal and enjoy one of the amazing treks that are out there. I will be back with another episode of the podcast next week. Hopefully it'll be with Jake, and we can be discussing, he's currently out in India, and I might not discuss with him because he sent me a video today because he saw a tiger today in the wild, which has been on my bucket list for so long. And I was supposed to be on that trip, but I stayed behind to go and do the destination show. And Jake took my place to head to India and managed to get to see a tiger in the wild, which I'm overjoyed for him that he managed to see one. But also at the same time, I'm just hoping that's not my one opportunity where I will get to see a tiger in the wild, because I've tried quite a lot to see a tiger in the wild. But we'll hear all about it from Jake when he gets back, and hopefully that will be next week. But he is heading off on a winter Toubkal trip next week as well, and Dave's heading off on our Sahara trek, so they're both very busy. So I hope I can grab Jake and have a quick chat with him at some point before he heads off. But we will at some point hear about that amazing trip that they've just had in India. Like I say, hopefully next week. But if not, it'll be very soon. And I will definitely be back next week with another episode of the BucketLister Podcast. But until then, thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the BucketLister Podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.